What if the exhaustion you feel now has nothing to do with how much you've done today? You sleep enough, you rest when you can, and still, by late afternoon, there's a heaviness that settles in, not in your legs or your back, but somewhere deeper, somewhere words don't quite reach. It's not the body that's tired, it's the mind that hasn't stopped reacting to the past, to what was said, to what wasn't, to the quiet disappointment no one sees. The body may have slowed, but the heart is still answering questions no one asked, still defending choices already made, still carrying conversations that ended years ago. Buddhism whispers something different here. It says, this stage of life is not about doing more. It's about releasing what no longer deserves your energy. Not because you've failed, not because you're giving up, but because you've carried enough. And the soul knows when it's time to put things down. As 2026 begins, you don't need a new version of yourself. You need a quieter relationship with what has been draining you. This isn't about becoming less, it's about becoming free. So stay with me for the next few minutes. Let the noise settle. What I want to share with you won't ask anything of you except perhaps one quiet breath before we continue. Because what comes next might be the permission you've been waiting for. 1. Aging does not exhaust us, reaction does. The body slows. That much is visible. You move a little differently now. Maybe you take the stairs more carefully. Maybe mornings take longer to unfold. This is natural. This is how time moves through flesh. But there's another kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with movement. It's the tiredness that lives in the chest when someone's name appears unexpectedly. The heaviness that settles in after a phone call that went nowhere. The weight that presses down when you lie awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation from last week or last decade, trying to rewrite what was already said. The mind does not slow the way the body does. It keeps returning, keeps replaying, keeps rehearsing alternate endings to scenes that have long since closed. And every time it does, something tightens. The jaw, the breath, the space between your thoughts. Buddhism names this clearly. Suffering does not come from what happened. It comes from the mind's insistence on continuing to react to what happened long after the moment has passed, long after the other person has forgotten, long after there is anything left to defend or correct. Each reaction now costs more than it used to. When you were younger, you could afford the energy. You could stay angry for days, hold a grudge through seasons, nurse a wound until it became identity. The body had reserves. The heart could metabolize conflict without collapsing. But now? Now the same emotional loop that once felt justified feels exhausting. You notice how much it takes just to stay braced against a memory. How tiring it is to keep explaining yourself to someone who isn't even in the room. This is not weakness. This is the body telling the truth before the mind is ready to listen. Wisdom in later life does not begin with new insight. It begins when you stop feeding what drains you, not because you've become enlightened, not because you've forgiven everything or released all attachment, but because you've finally felt, in your own flesh, what it costs to keep reacting, and you've grown too tired to pretend it's worth it. There is a quietness that appears when reaction stops. Not peace, necessarily, not resolution, just less. Less noise, less defense, less need to be right about something that no longer matters. And in that less, something shifts, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The breath deepens, the shoulders drop, the night becomes just night again. 2. Attention is the last great wealth. You've watched things leave. The job title that once defined you, the income that felt permanent, the role people needed you to play: parent, provider, the one who held things together. Some of these things you released willingly. Others were taken quietly, without ceremony. And what remains now is smaller, quieter, less visible to the world. But there is one thing that has not diminished. One resource that still belongs entirely to you, even when everything else has changed. Your attention. Not your energy that comes and goes, not your time that moves whether you direct it or not, but where you place your awareness in any given moment. What you allow your mind to rest upon, what you choose to feed with the limited focus you have left. This is the last great wealth, and most of us are spending it without realizing. You can feel it happening. You're sitting in a room that's quiet, and your attention drifts to the argument from yesterday, to the phone call that didn't come, to the thing someone said 3 weeks ago that still sits unresolved in your chest. And suddenly, the room isn't quiet anymore. Your breath tightens, your body braces. You're no longer here, you're back there, reacting to something that already ended. Where attention goes, the mind follows. And where the mind goes, the body must live. Buddhism doesn't call this wrong. It calls it unexamined. Because most of the time, we don't choose where attention lands. We simply let it fall wherever the loudest pain calls it. And the loudest pain is rarely the most important. Right attention doesn't mean positive thinking. It doesn't mean looking away from difficulty or pretending suffering isn't real. It means something quieter. Noticing where your awareness is being pulled and asking very gently whether that place nourishes peace or whether it only deepens disturbance. Not every thought deserves the same amount of you. Not every memory needs to be revisited just because it arrives. Not every regret requires your full presence. Not every fear about tomorrow needs to be examined tonight, in the dark, when you're already tired. When you notice your mind drifting back there, name it softly, returning, and feel one slow exhale. You have so little energy left to waste on what doesn't restore you. And this isn't selfishness. This is survival. This is the quiet intelligence that appears when you finally lived long enough to know the difference between what must be attended to and what is simply repeating because you haven't yet learned to let it pass. Attention is currency, and you're allowed to stop spending it on people and situations that will never give anything back. Not out of bitterness, not out of rejection. Let 2026 be the year you spend it with intention. But because you've begun to understand that peace is not something you find later, it's what appears when you stop feeding what disturbs you now. 3. Focusing on yourself is not selfish. It is responsibility. For most of your life, the question wasn't whether to care for others. It was how much of yourself you could give before something broke. You learned early that love meant putting someone else first. That being good meant making space even when you had none left. That maturity was measured by how quietly you could dissolve your own needs in service of someone else's comfort. And you did it. For decades. You showed up. You gave. You stayed when it would have been easier to leave. You became the person others leaned on, and you wore that role without complaint, because it felt like proof you mattered. But somewhere along the way, something hardened. Not in your heart toward them. In your heart toward yourself. Because every time you said yes when your body wanted to say no, a small resentment took root. Every time you prioritized someone else's peace over your own rest, the debt grew heavier. And now, in later life, you find yourself exhausted not just by what you've done, but by what you've never allowed yourself to need. This is the cost of abandoning yourself for too long. Buddhism doesn't call this virtue, It calls it imbalance, because when care flows only outward and never inward, what remains is not love. It's depletion dressed as devotion. Turning inward now feels selfish. It feels like withdrawal, like you're betraying the people who still need you, or dishonoring the person you've always been. But here's what's true: you still have an inner life, and that life still requires attention, stillness, and care, whether anyone else acknowledges it or not. You don't stop being responsible for your own heart just because you've gotten older. You don't lose the right to rest just because others have come to expect your availability. And you don't owe constant sacrifice as payment for being loved. Focusing on yourself is not rejection. It's not coldness. It's not turning away from the people who matter. It's finally recognizing that you are also one of the people who matter. This shift doesn't require an announcement. It doesn't need permission. It begins quietly, in small refusals you would have swallowed before, in moments where you choose rest over performance, in the decision to stop answering every need as though your worth depends on it. And yes, people may notice. They may feel the absence of what you used to provide so freely. They may even call it selfish, because they've grown comfortable with your depletion. But their comfort is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is this: to live the rest of your life without abandoning the one person who has been with you from the beginning, yourself, not because you've earned it, not because you've suffered enough to deserve peace, but because you're still here, still breathing, still carrying an inner world that no one else will tend to if you don't. And that world is all you have left to live inside. 4. The silent contract that causes pain. There's a conversation you've been having for years that no one else knows about. It goes something like this: I gave so much. I showed up. I sacrificed. I put them first. So why don't they call more often? Why don't they remember? Why don't they see what I did? You never said this out loud. You never wrote it down as a demand. But somewhere deep inside, a contract was signed, and the terms were clear. If I give enough, I will be valued. If I love well enough, I will not be forgotten. If I do what's right, the world will return what I'm owed. And now, in later life, the silence on the other end of that contract is unbearable. Not because you're bitter, not because you regret what you gave, but because the return you expected quietly, without ever admitting it, hasn't come. And the weight of that unspoken expectation is crushing you in ways you can't name. Buddhism sees this clearly. It doesn't say, you're wrong to have loved. It doesn't say you shouldn't have given. But it names the place where love became transaction, where care became currency, where devotion turned into a ledger you keep checking, hoping the balance will finally tip in your favor. The suffering isn't in what they didn't give back. The suffering is in the belief that love works this way, that it moves in circles, that what you offer must return, that kindness is a loan waiting to be repaid. This is attachment, not to a person, not even to an outcome, but to the idea that the universe keeps score, that fairness exists, that giving guarantees receiving, and it doesn't. You can love someone completely and receive nothing in return. You can sacrifice everything and still be forgotten. You can show up for decades and still find yourself alone on a Tuesday afternoon, wondering why no one thought to check in. This is not injustice. This is just how it is. And the moment you stop demanding that it be different, the moment you release the silent contract you've been holding over everyone, including yourself, something shifts. Not because people suddenly change, not because love finally arrives in the shape you needed, but because you stop measuring. You stop keeping track. You stop bracing against the disappointment of not being seen the way you hoped. There's an old teaching: the gift is complete the moment it leaves your hand. Not when it's acknowledged, not when it's returned, not when someone finally understands what it cost you. The moment it leaves your hand, everything after that, the gratitude, the recognition, the love that may or may not come back, belongs to a different story. One you were never meant to control. Releasing the contract doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you harden your heart or close the door on connection. It means you finally stop waiting for the world to repay a debt it never agreed to carry. And in that release, the heart doesn't break. It breathes. 5. Silence in later life is maturity, not withdrawal. There's a moment that comes, usually without announcement, when you realize you don't need to say it anymore. The correction you used to make, the defense you used to offer, the explanation you spent years perfecting so people would finally understand why you chose what you chose, why you are the way you are. And one day, in the middle of a conversation that used to matter, you feel the words rise and then stop. Not because you're angry, not because you've given up, but because something inside has shifted and the need to be understood has quietly dissolved. This is not withdrawal, though it will be mistaken for that. People will notice the silence and assume you're fading. That age has made you passive, that you've lost interest in connection, in being seen, in participating the way you used to. But the truth is different. Silence is what appears when understanding ripens. When you've lived enough seasons to know that most misunderstandings cannot be resolved through explanation, that some people will never see you clearly, no matter how many words you offer. That being right doesn't change anything, and being understood doesn't heal what you thought it would. This isn't bitterness, this is clarity. You've simply reached the end of needing the world to agree with your version of events. You've stopped trying to manage perception, defend your choices, or correct the record every time someone gets it wrong. And what remains, in the absence of all that speech, is not emptiness. It's space. It's rest. It's the quiet that appears when you finally stop performing your own justification. Buddhism doesn't call this giving up. It calls this maturity. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that looks like less but feels like more. Because silence, when it comes from understanding rather than defeat, carries a different quality. It doesn't shrink. It doesn't apologize. It simply exists, without needing to prove it has the right to be there. You've lived many seasons now. You've seen relationships turn. You've watched certainty become doubt, and doubt become acceptance. You've learned that most of what you thought you needed to say was just noise, trying to protect a self that didn't need defending. And now, when someone misreads you, you let them. When someone assumes the wrong thing, you don't rush to correct it. Not because you don't care, but because you've finally understood that their version of you was never yours to control. This is not silence born from exhaustion. This is silence born from knowing. And knowing doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need agreement. It just is. Quiet, clear, unshaken, and entirely enough. 6. When explanation stops, energy returns. You've been explaining yourself for so long that you don't notice the weight of it anymore. Why you made that choice. Why you reacted that way. Why you're not what they expected. Why your life looks different from what it was supposed to be. The explanations rise automatically now, almost before you're conscious of them. Someone raises an eyebrow, and you're already building the case. Someone questions your decision, and you feel your chest tighten as you prepare the defense again. And every time you do this, something leaks. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else can see, but you feel it. In the tightness that stays in your throat after the conversation ends, in the exhaustion that settles in even when nothing difficult happened, in the way your mind keeps rehearsing what you should have said. What you're really doing is trying to control perception, not because you're manipulative, but because somewhere inside you believe that if you can just find the right words, people will see you correctly. They'll stop judging, they'll approve, they'll let you be. But perception doesn't work that way. You can explain yourself perfectly and still be misunderstood. You can lay out every reason and still be dismissed. You can offer your entire history as evidence and still be reduced to someone's assumption. Buddhism sees this clearly. Explanation is not clarity, it's negotiation. It's the belief that your peace depends on convincing someone else to accept your version of the truth. And that belief quietly exhausts you, because it means you're constantly braced, constantly ready, constantly scanning for the moment when you'll need to justify, defend, or correct the record. There's no rest in that. But something shifts when explanation stops, not because you've decided to withhold, not because you've grown cold or indifferent, but because you've finally felt in your own body how much energy it costs to keep managing everyone's understanding of you. When you stop explaining, the shoulders drop first. Then the breath deepens. The jaw unclenches. The mind, which has been running endless simulations of how to be seen correctly, finally goes quiet. And here's what's strange. Life begins to respond differently, not because you've convinced anyone, not because you've finally been understood, but because you've stopped asking for permission to be what you already are. People sense this shift, even if they can't name it. They stop pushing for explanations because you're no longer offering the opening. Conflicts that used to spiral into long justifications simply end. Misunderstandings remain misunderstandings, but they no longer pull you into their orbit. You are no longer negotiating your right to exist as you are. And the energy that was leaking slowly, constantly, invisibly begins to return, not as power, not as confidence, just as space, as breath, as the quiet relief of no longer needing the world to agree with you before you can rest. 7. Comparison is a quiet form of self-harm. You see someone your age and the measurement begins before you're even aware of it. They look better. They move easier. They're still traveling, still working, still doing the things you've had to let go of. And in that instant, so quick you almost miss it, your life shrinks, becomes less, becomes evidence of something you're doing wrong. This happens in silence, in the grocery store, in a photograph on someone's feed, in a casual conversation where someone mentions their plans and you realize you have none. The comparison doesn't feel like a choice. It feels automatic, necessary even, as if measuring yourself against someone else's rhythm will somehow reveal what you're supposed to be doing, where you're supposed to be by now. But here's what actually happens in the body when you compare. The chest tightens, the breath shortens, a heaviness settles in that wasn't there a moment ago. You were fine, and then you saw them, and suddenly you're behind. Suddenly you're failing at something you didn't even know was a race. This is not insight. This is harm. Buddhism names it clearly. Comparison is violence turned inward. Not because you're intentionally cruel to yourself, but because you're forcing your life into a season it doesn't belong in. You're demanding that your winter match someone else's summer, that your slowing match someone else's momentum, that your quiet match someone else's noise. And the body knows immediately that this is wrong. No two lives age at the same rhythm. Some bodies give out early. Some minds fade faster. Some people lose their partners young, while others grow old together. Some keep working because they love it. Others keep working because they have no choice. Some travel because they can. Others stay home and find peace in smaller rooms. None of this is better. None of this is worse. It's just different timing, different unfolding, different seasons arriving when they arrive. But comparison erases that truth. It flattens every life into a single standard and then punishes you for not meeting it. You don't need to be where they are. You don't need to move at their pace. You don't need to still be doing what you used to do, or what someone else your age is doing, or what you imagined you'd be doing by now. You only need to be honest about what your life is asking of you in this season. And right now, maybe it's asking you to slow down, to stop less, to release what no longer fits, to sit quietly instead of filling every hour, to let go of the belief that your worth is measured by how much you still resemble the person you were 10 years ago. Peace doesn't return because you finally catch up. It returns when you stop running. When you let your life unfold at its own rhythm without forcing it to match anyone else's, and the moment you do, the chest opens, the breath deepens, the race you were never meant to be in finally ends. 8. Time is no longer to be filled, it is to be inhabited. There's a strangeness to having time now that you didn't have before. Not the busy kind, not the scheduled kind, just time. Long afternoons that don't demand anything. Mornings that unfold slowly. Days where nothing needs to be built, fixed, or finished. And instead of relief, there's often guilt, because for most of your life, time was something to be used. It was a resource you spent wisely or wasted foolishly. It was measured in accomplishments, in forward motion, in visible proof that you were doing something with your life. Empty time meant failure. It meant laziness. It meant you weren't trying hard enough, so you filled it with work, errands, obligations, plans. Even rest had to be justified, earned through exhaustion, scheduled between tasks, brief enough that it didn't feel indulgent. And now the days are slower. The calendar is emptier. And the old panic rises. What am I doing? Why does it feel like nothing is happening? But here's what's actually happening, something your body knows, even if your mind doesn't trust it yet. Time has stopped being something you move through. It's becoming something you live inside. Earlier in life, time was linear, a path you traveled, a resource you spent. You were always going somewhere, building towards something, measuring progress by how much you'd done. But later in life, time changes shape. It stops pulling you forward. It stops demanding productivity. And what remains is not emptiness, it's space. Space where awareness can finally settle. Where the mind doesn't have to race from one task to the next. Where the body can exist without being useful. This is not loss. This is permission. The slower days you're living now are not wasted. They are the first days in your entire life where you're not being asked to perform, produce, or prove anything. And yes, it feels strange. Because you've been trained to believe that value comes from doing. That meaning requires momentum. That if you're not building something, you're falling behind. But Buddhism teaches something different. It teaches that awareness itself is enough. that presence itself is complete. That the fullness of life doesn't come from filling time, it comes from inhabiting it. You don't need to do anything with this afternoon. You don't need to make it count. Just notice one ordinary thing: light on the wall, a cup in your hand, the sound of breath, and let it be enough for 10 seconds. You can simply be here, in this room, in this light, in this breath, not waiting for the next thing, not preparing for what comes later, just here. And when you stop trying to fill the time, when you finally let yourself rest inside it, something shifts. The guilt fades, the restlessness softens, the day becomes enough, not because you did something with it, but because you were finally present for it. 9. Quiet. Self-work is the deepest practice. You've noticed small things changing, but they feel too quiet to matter. You sleep a little differently now. Not perfectly, not every night. But there are moments when you lie down and the body softens faster than it used to, when the mind doesn't spiral quite so far before it lets go. You react less to things that used to pull you under. Someone says something cutting and you feel the old heat rise, but it doesn't take over the way it once did. It passes, quicker than before, quieter. You know when to stop now, when to end the conversation before it turns, when to step back instead of pushing through, when to let something be unfinished rather than forcing it to resolution. These are not dramatic shifts. No one applauds, no one notices, and because they make no sound, you wonder sometimes if they even count. There's a part of you that still believes growth should be visible, that real change announces itself. That transformation means becoming someone recognizably different, someone others can see and confirm. But Buddhism teaches something else entirely. It teaches that the deepest practice is invisible, that the most meaningful shifts happen in silence, in small adjustments no one witnesses, that the growth you protect from announcement becomes the growth that lasts. Because here's what happens when change is made public. It becomes performance. You declare you're letting go, and suddenly you're managing how others perceive your letting go. You announce you're choosing peace, and now peace becomes something you have to prove. You tell people you're done reacting, and the moment you react again, you feel like a fraud. The declaration turns the practice into theater, and theater requires an audience, and an audience requires consistency, visible progress, proof that you're still doing what you said you'd do. But the quiet work, the work you do in the dark, in the middle of the night, when no one is watching, that work doesn't need applause. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be seen to be real. You sleep more gently, not because you've mastered something, but because your nervous system has finally begun to trust that rest is safe. You react less, not because you've decided to be calm, but because your body has learned, slowly, that not every provocation requires a defense. You know when to stop, not because you've become enlightened, but because you've felt, enough times now, what it costs to keep going when everything inside says enough. These changes are fragile at first, easily disrupted, easily lost if exposed too soon. So you don't speak them, you don't announce them, you simply live them, quietly, in the small moments when no one is paying attention. And over time, not quickly, not dramatically, they settle. They become part of the rhythm of your days, part of how you move through difficulty, part of who you are now, not because you declared it, but because you lived it long enough in silence that it became real. This is the deepest practice, not the one anyone sees, the one only you know is happening. 10. When you choose yourself calmly, life rearranges. You've been preparing for conversations you may never need to have. The one where you tell them you can't keep doing this. The one where you explain why you need space. The one where you set boundaries, draw lines, make your position clear so they finally understand that something has changed. You rehearse these conversations in the shower, in the car, in the middle of the night. You refine the words. You anticipate the pushback.